I was minding my own business in 1970 when evidently the congregation had a council meeting and decided to call 4 of us young people to the ministry. And I wasn't there. One of the elders from the congregation, Elder Ed, came to our house after the meeting that evening, and he sat down and said, Brother Hostetler, he says, we've called you to the ministry. We expect you to perform according to these expectations, and so on and so on. We want you to preach in 2 weeks. Well, I was 17 years old, and the last thing in the world I was interested in was preaching. I was interested in the 2 things that 17-year-old boys are interested in. And so, cars and girls. And but I did. I preached in 2 weeks, and it was awful, and I said everything I could say, and 2 minutes had gone by, and then I repeated myself, and they never asked me to preach again, but they did ask me after I graduated from high school to be licensed to the ministry. They were seeing something that I didn't see, and so I said, okay. Meanwhile, my last year in college, I was walking down the hallway in the administration building one day, and Paul Hoffman went by, and he says, there's a little church outside of Manchester, the Pleasant View Church of the Brethren, that needs a preacher. And he says, I can't do that anymore. He says, I think you ought to go out there and preach. I said, I don't know anything about preaching. I've only preached once in my life. And he says, well, they'll pay you $10 a Sunday. I said, fine, I'll do it. And so I went out there and inflicted those people with these sermons, over a year and during the summer, and fully intending to teach. Well, through that year, there was a fellow in that congregation who was a farmer, and he and I would go golfing a lot. One day, as I was nearing the end of all of that experience, he says, one day when we were golfing, we think you really have some skills for ministry, and we think you ought to do that as a vocation. And I said, well, I'm planning to teach. And he says, we think you ought to give it a try.
For me, feeling call started when I was in 3rd grade. I was at a sacred campfire at Camp Swatara in Pennsylvania. And at that particular campfire, at the conclusion, they did the, if you want to give your life to Jesus thing. And the offer was given, and it was really incredible because there I am sitting on the pew, and the invitation is to come to the center, and I'm up in the center before I even realize what's going on. There's like this magnet. And being in 3rd grade, I had not a clue what was going on, but I think that was the beginning of the call. Growing up in the church, the elders, the deacons, they continue to tap you on the shoulder. And I remember particularly one Sunday, actually it was Stan Nofsinger's licensing Sunday, and he was licensed that Sunday, and John Buckwalter, one of the deacons of the church, came up to me at the back of the church, and he looked at me and he said, okay, so when are you going to answer the call? And I laughed in his face, and just turned around and said, that'll never happen, because I really didn't think it would, being a woman in the church. I figured I would probably serve Christ in some way, but not in the pastoral ministry. So the people keep tapping, making those kinds of comments, and I kept thinking, I'm going to run, run as far as I can, as fast as I can, because it just didn't feel right. Then I was at camp again, Camp Swatara. I served there for several summers, and the community around me at that particular time, back in the late 70s, early 80s, just started affirming gifts. And so finally at the end of the summer, one of the guys, Dean Lengel, came up to me and looked at me, and he said, Sarah, it's time for you to stop running and just answer the call to ministry. What I finally did is I went to Ross Nofsinger. He was my pastor at the time. And I said, Ross, it seems to me I need to stop running. And Ross just took me into his office, sat down and said, okay, tell me about this call thing. So we probably talked for an hour or so, sharing with how I felt my call to be in ministry. And Ross actually thought that I could do it because he invited me into his office. And at the conclusion of the 2-hour conversation with Ross, Ross says, okay, it says, let's join hands, and we'll walk through the process together.
I didn't know what a call meant. When I was a teenager, we had a youth retreat, a youth rally, they called it, in Northern Ohio, at my local church. And I went to that because I had the key to the church. And so I thought, well, I'll just go, and I'm not going to stay because I didn't know what a district rally was. And when I got there, I found out it was kind of fun, so I hung around. That evening, they were having elections or calling out for new cabinet members. And I remember they said for, my area, our region, I was to go to this one classroom. And I was there, and they were taking nominations for people to be on cabinet, and they were putting everybody's names on the board. This one guy tapped me, and he said, "What's your name?" And I told him, and he said, "I nominate her." My name went on the board, and I was nominated, or I was elected. That was kind of a turning point in my life, and it was more around leadership. I didn't know what cabinet was, but I was happy to be on it. And then that got me more involved in outdoor ministry. Went on then to help direct the youth camp at our summer camp, Inspiration Hills. And while I was there, I just had a powerful spiritual experience, one that God became alive for me. And I really understood what it meant to follow Christ. And through that experience, I sensed a call, a strong desire to do something beyond where I was. And a lot of people along the way who encouraged me. I think Art Foreman was one who was in outdoor ministry, who really encouraged me, showed me that I had the gifts, encouraged me to use those gifts. And then a little bit later, Randy Yoder, who said, practice those gifts and work harder to develop new gifts. To be ordained was at one point very important for me because I was in a ministry that was mainly male and that I was easily overlooked. So I think I had to define that for myself, and for myself to say, this is important ministry, and it doesn't matter how I'm defined or how I'm seen. This is what I do, and this is where God wants me to be right now.
Well, I spent a great number of years just as a layperson in the church, and very active in the local congregation, in the district, and in fact in the denomination. And all along the way, I always wondered if there was something more that I was to be doing. Persons would come along and say, well, have you ever considered licensing? Have you ever considered ministry? And so I suppose that it was a kind of a combination of factors and time that finally made it all come together. The person who was pastoring our church left, and I found by this time I had been licensed, not knowing what that meant. I had engaged in the trim program, not knowing where that would lead. And shortly after our pastor left and went elsewhere, I found myself as part of an interim team with 2 other men. There were 3 of us doing this. And interestingly enough, after about a year and a half, as that's the length of time that we were doing this on an interim basis. And what began to happen is most of the pastoral care work began to fall to me. I think that's what first drew me into it in a big way. And I don't know why, but it just seemed as though I was able to do that. Not that I certainly had all the answers to all of those situations, but I quickly learned it was just a matter of being the presence of God in those difficult times as well as the joyful times. Where else can you celebrate a new birth early in the morning and by evening be with somebody who goes on to the next life, And I realized what a privilege it was to be engaged in people's lives in a significant way, and that I seemed to have the whatever I needed for doing that work. And so I still don't have all the answers, but the call is still strong that that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I cannot imagine myself doing anything else right now. I left nearly 28 years in another industry. Frankly, was making much more money than I am making now. And in the physical realm, none of this made any sense in an earthly way of looking at things. But I think the Lord caused me after a while to become so dissatisfied with what I was doing, and so many other things began to fall into place, that I had to just realize that, yeah, God does know what He's doing, and I might not be perfect, but He is, and therefore I will just make myself available and serve, and that call still feels very strong in my life.